Good afternoon, class. I'm sorry to meet you like this, but unfortunately, I am feeling well under the weather. So, what I'm going to do is I'm going to pre record this lecture and post it to YouTube, and you will need to watch this lecture before you take exam two, but I'll explain more once we get back in person in class. This will be lecture number 3 for exam two, and I'll explain more once we sort of get back to normal and back into the classroom, so bear with me. So last time we sort of left off with King George III. He decides not to send more troops to America, especially after the devastating defeat of General Cornwallis at the Battle of Yorktown. So that was sort of the phase two of the American Revolution, which was actually fighting the revolution. So now that King George has sort of decided not to continue on this conflict, we have to look at phase three. And phase three simply is diplomacy. So after this Battle of Yorktown, General Cornwallis is in shame. It's really to say the least. He allowed a mostly volunteer army, the Continental Army, to defeat a global superpower that is Great Britain. It's after the Battle of Yorktown that basically all British hopes for a military victory in America were dashed. So that's one of the big things you need to know about Yorktown is that after the events that take place at Yorktown, all hopes for any sort of military victory for Great Britain is soon dashed. Now, the Prime Minister of Great Britain was still Lord North at the time, and when he heard that General Cornwallis had surrendered at Yorktown, he acted as if he had taken a physical bullet. And when he heard the news, he proclaimed, this is a direct quote from Lord North. Lord North states, "Oh God, it is all over." And for the British in America, Lord North was absolutely right. It was indeed all over. So instead of King George III sending more troops to America, he instead decides to contact Benjamin Franklin in early 1782 to negotiate a peace treaty. Now, Ben Franklin also takes John Adams and John Jay with him in order to negotiate this type of peace. King George III wanted to sign a peace treaty without the French present. Ben Franklin replied to King George III that they would not abandon their allies to sign a peace treaty with, quote, what he said, Great Britain to be an unjust and cruel enemy. Once the negotiations soon began, it was in late February, actually to be exact, the 27th. The 27th of February, 1782, Great Britain's Parliament voted on the negotiations of peace with America. Parliament decided that peace with America was the right option so that they could focus their efforts on continuing their global conflicts with countries like Spain and France. It is extremely difficult to fight multiple nations by yourself and at the same time, so they decided that peace was necessary. On the 20th of March, 1782, Prime Minister Lord North resigned his position as Prime Minister. At the same time that Lord North resigned his position, the French informed Benjamin Franklin that America could negotiate its own peace treaty with Great Britain. The French allowed the Americans to break the Treaty of Alliance because the French got what they wanted: revenge on Great Britain. When the Continental Congress heard that Parliament was willing to negotiate a peace treaty with America, they formed a select and prominent American committee, if you will. And these Americans go to Paris. So they go to Paris and they negotiate this treaty and these different terms of peace with Great Britain. The committee chose the following people. Of course, John Adams, who was a U.S. ambassador to the Netherlands. You had John Jay, who was a U.S. ambassador to Spain. And of course, Benjamin Franklin, who was the U.S. ambassador to France. And he just so happened to be in France at the time. The peace treaty negotiations lasted for months, but finally it comes to an end on the 3rd of September, 1783. The Treaty of Paris was signed by both the warring nations of America and Great Britain. The terms of the treaty favored the victorious Americans, of course. Now, here are 5 of the most important things and the most important provisions in the Treaty of Paris, 1783, that you guys need to know. Number one, Great Britain formally recognized America as an independent nation. Incredibly important. Secondly, America's new western border was the Mississippi River. This new border doubled the size of this newly created nation. Again, very important. Thirdly, Florida was now back in control of Spain from Great Britain. Again, very important. Americans agreed to pay off debts that were owed to the British merchants. That was number four. And lastly, and most importantly, the last British troops were set to leave America by November of 1783. And we'll see that the British don't necessarily follow that last provision, and that is going to lead to the War of 1812, which we'll talk about later on this semester. So after the revolution is over and this peace treaty is signed, we need to take a look at who the biggest loser is in this Treaty of Paris 1783. No, it's not Great Britain. No, it's not America. No, it's not Spain. No, it's not France. But let's take a look at Native Americans. Native Americans were not present at the signing of this treaty, and of course, with them not being there, they have no role in determining these new American borders. So that's incredibly important to explain the relationship between the Americans and obviously the Native Americans as well. George Washington retired from the Continental Army, but he entered the newly created nation as a public servant. Most wars are often used as engines for change, and the American Revolution is definitely used for that, no doubt. The American War for Independence crushed the status quo, and it broke the old norms of society. War often affects the world politically, economically, and socially, and the American Revolution is par for the course to affect all three. The American Revolution quickly became this engine for change for many Americans. Many of these average, everyday American citizens, obviously, they're wondering what form of government would be the best, really, to create this new American republic. So we'll really start to see the development of something called Republican ideology. Now, this is Republican ideology with a small r. This has nothing to do with today's, modern political parties. But let's take a look at what this small r Republican ideology looks like. Many of the American revolutionaries, they followed this idea of something called republicanism. And this idea of republicanism was strictly against the idea of a monarchy or an aristocratic style government. So republicanism put a lot of faith in the people instead of just a handful of people or even one as a king or queen. You get the idea. The new American Republic itself was not a democracy in its purest sense of the word. Now, let's take a look at Athens and Greece. Now, both of those they practiced direct democracy in its purest sense. Now, in the United States, or in America, that meant that every male citizen voted on every single thing that directly affected them. Now, in America, we don't do that. Of course, we have a representative style democracy, which we'll see that comes to sort of take place after the American Revolution. The new American Republic obviously practices this idea of a representative democracy. American land-owning white men elected other land-owning white men to make decisions on their behalf. Representative democracy would allow for greater transparency than having a monarch or a king, queen, or a aristocratic style of government. The American revolutionaries, they wanted to protect the rights that basically they fought for in the American Revolution. That's pretty straightforward. These revolutionaries, they wanted to protect personal rights and personal liberties from being taken or destroyed by any national government or national entity. So the states, they began to create their own state constitutions. Not only was a new national government being created, but also these state governments were also being created at the same time. Again, incredibly important. Every state constitution was concerned with preserving that Republican ideology of limiting the powers of government. one of the most unique things to come out of the states creating their own constitutions was the election of individual state governors as opposed to the royally appointed governors by the king. Obviously, governors were limited in their powers because a lot of the legislating power was left up to the elected legislature. So, with all of these, political developments going on, let's take a step back and let's take a look at July 1776. Well, during the month of July 1776, the Continental Congress created a committee to create a draft constitution. Now, this draft constitution is often called the Articles of Confederation. The Articles of Confederation were ratified, or they were accepted, in March of 1781. The Articles of Confederation basically, quote unquote, legalized all the things that the Continental Congress was doing since the Declaration of Independence. The Articles of Confederation does the following, and you'll need to know several of these. Number one, the Articles of Confederation did not create an executive position, so there was no office of the president under the Articles of Confederation. Number two, the Articles of Confederation created a one-house legislature. So obviously today that's changed. We obviously don't have the Articles of Confederation any longer. We have the United States Constitution, which establishes a two-house legislature, which is the House of Representatives and the Senate, and it makes up Congress. But the Articles of Confederation only creates a one-house legislature. Number three, the one-house legislature had the ability to handle all foreign affairs, and that's incredibly important. Now, this one-house legislature does not have the right to pass taxes. This one-house legislature had to get money by asking for it from the states personally, but of course, many of the states ignored the requests for money, so there is no power of coercion. They cannot pass or legislate any taxes. Now, what you're really going to want to write down is that according to the Articles of Confederation, 9 out of the 13 states had to approve things regarding the following. 9 out of the 13 states had to approve of the country going to war. 9 out of the 13 states had to approve of foreign treaties. 9 out of the 13 states had to approve of federal coinage or the producing of any sort of currency that the national government would use. 9 out of the 13 states had to approve of budgets or financing or finances of the federal government. And finally, 9 out of the 13 states had to approve any usage of America's Army or Navy. But one of the biggest flaws of the Articles of Confederation is that they're rather weak. And they're rather weak, especially when it comes to the creation of a national government. But a lot of Americans saw that this was the best option for this new American republic. The Articles of Confederation also allowed for an expanded participation in the political process. Now, keep in mind that by this time, most white men could already vote, but the property requirements to vote were lowered after 1776. So what they're aiming for is universal white male suffrage. So they want every white male to be able to vote in this political process. Many of the average everyday Americans, they were arguing the point that no man could be free unless he possesses a voice. And their voice, what they mean, is in the political process. So that's why you see a lot of the political process being expanded to give more men the right to vote and to have this political voice. Now, just because the political process is expanded doesn't mean it's great. Also, keep in mind that voting rights were not extended to, of course, slave men, Native American men, or even women at the time, but it's a slow process that comes along a lot later. Now, keep in mind, too, that according to the Articles of Confederation, each state had one vote. That's going to be incredibly important because keep in mind that the population of each state did not matter. It didn't matter if you were Rhode Island and you had a population of 68,000 people compared to, say, the state of Virginia, who has a population of 747,000 people. It doesn't matter about the population. What matters is that each state was afforded one vote. Incredibly important to note. But one of the most important things to realize and to remember is that the United States just got done fighting the world's largest superpower that is run by a monarchy government alongside of parliament. So obviously, the United States is not going to want a super strong national government. So the Articles of Confederation purposefully makes the national government incredibly weak. And what I mean by weak, the national government could not enforce its own laws, and frankly, it couldn't even settle its own war debts that it had, taken on because of the American Revolution, and that's going to be incredibly difficult to pay off those British merchants that the Americans agreed to in the Treaty of Paris, 1783. The best example of this, so the one house legislature, like I mentioned earlier, could only ask the states for money. It couldn't, force them to pay taxes. And this is the best example that I could find. So in 1782, the One House Congress, it asked the states to collectively give the national government about $8 million. So this is $8 million in 1782 money. That's a pretty considerable chunk of change, right? From this $8 million that was requested by this one house legislature, the states only were able to give about $420,000, not even a million. So this was incredibly difficult for this Articles of Confederation and the United States government to collect money that it needed to settle these war debts. And we'll see how that changes momentarily. So keep in mind that the war is now over with. America has officially won its independence, but what about those people called the Loyalists? So the Loyalists, remember, the ones that still supported the British Crown. They did not support the Continental Congress. They did not support the Continental Army. They don't support America's plea for independence. So what about them? Many of the Loyalists, during and after the American Revolution, they saw their property either confiscated or they saw it destroyed. After the American victory at Yorktown, many of the American Loyalists who were still loyal to the British Crown, they fled to the American seaports, and they were quick to board British ships to make their way back to Great Britain. In fact, about 80,000 white American loyalists, free African Americans, slaves, and Native Americans, again, who are all loyalists to the British Crown, they're in panic mode. Now, some of these American loyalists, they were able to make their way to Great Britain, and all was said and done. But many dispersed all around the British Empire. Now, some loyalists were able to make it to Canada. Some were now in British-owned Florida. Others were moved into Spanish territories, and many actually converted to Catholicism to get away from having their, lands and their property, either confiscated or destroyed by the Americans. So, like I've mentioned before, war is often used as an engine for change, whether that be economically, whether that be socially, so on and so forth. But one of the biggest, and this is something you might want to underline in your notes, one of the most important social changes of the revolution was the mass exodus of these, American loyalists. Their homes, lands, and jobs obviously were confiscated by the American patriots, which opened up a lot more economic, social, and political opportunities for those American patriots. So that's going to be something very important to note. So let's take a quick look at post-war America. The transition between war and peacetime was not that easy of a task. Many of the revolutionaries were now serving in the government of their new nation. People like Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, George Washington, Alexander Hamilton, so on and so forth. Many of them were attempting to do something that had never been done before, forging a brand new nation from a confederation of 13 rebellious colonies. From the drafting of the Declaration of Independence in 1776 to the creation of the United States Constitution in 1787, to the election of Thomas Jefferson in 1800, this is an incredibly unstable time in the American Republic. At the end of the American Revolution, the country was in debt of about $160 million. Obviously, this isn't a small chunk of change. I could probably do a lot with $160 million, and I imagine most of you could also do something with $160 million. Now, the founders had or what they do is they have strong differing opinions, especially about things like foreign relations, the economy, politics, and really the time period between 1783 and 1787 was a very critical period in American history, and this is noted by future President John Quincy Adams. In this very critical and very crucial period in American history, America began to develop this idea of something called federalism. And the idea of federalism is the sharing of governmental power from the national to the state to the local levels. So, kind of like something we do today. Obviously, we have our local governments, we have our state governments, and of course, we have the national government. This idea of shared powers or shared governmental powers between all three, the idea of federalism. Rightfully so, so many Americans feared that bigger government would turn America into Great Britain 2.0, and that's exactly what they want to avoid. After the war, the lands owned by America were now doubled in size, and they had to figure out what exactly to do with all this new land. And with all of this new land, the American government passes something called the Land Ordinance, the Land Ordinance of 1785. And what this does is it tries to organize what they knew as the Northwest Territory. And this Northwest Territory eventually makes up the states of Ohio, Michigan, Indiana, and Illinois. Now, the Land Ordinance actually establishes America's brand new western border. The Land Ordinance also created new townships, and it had broken up into different sections of about 640 acres apiece. And all of these new 640 acres of land were auctioned off because they were technically property of the United States government after the Treaty of Paris of 1783. All that auction money for all of this land, all of these land sales goes directly to the United States Treasury. And this was able to relieve the climbing war debts from the American Revolution. Now, keep in mind that the Americans completely and totally disregard the Native Americans who are still on those lands. So this is obviously going to lead to a lot of problems later on down the line, and we'll see that before the end of the course. Sometimes the United States government purchased these Native American lands, but there were more instances than not that American settlers just kind of took it upon themselves to take the land that they believed to be theirs. 2 years after passing the Land Ordinance of 1785, the one House legislature passes something called the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. The Northwest Ordinance of 1787 has three key principles, and you'll need to know all three. First of all, the new Western territories, eventually what become the states of Ohio, Michigan, and so on and so forth, they were to be treated as co-equals to the already established states. Great Britain treated their colonies and their new territories as subordinate with the sole purpose of benefiting the mother country of Great Britain, and that's something that the Americans want to avoid. So they would rather unite as one instead of having this new land and these people on this new land considered to be lesser than the already established states in the U.S. By this time already, it was made known that taking Native American lands was going to be a problem, especially if the United States government didn't pay for them in some way, shape, or form. So the second principle in the Northwest Ordinance of 1787, it promises that Native American lands were to never be taken from them without their permission. And thirdly, Thomas Jefferson wanted to ban slavery north of the Ohio River. So this was included in the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. The Northwest Ordinance also established the criteria for a territory to become a state. And in order for a territory To become a state, it must go through a three-stage process, which again, you'll need to know this three-stage process. First of all, Congress would appoint a governor to handle the territory's legal matters and to establish a legal code of this new territorial land. The population of the territory had to reach 5,000 males, 5,000 males, in order to begin electing a territory or a territorial legislature. So first of all, Congress appoints a governor to establish law, basically a legal code in this territory. Secondly, the population of that territory needed to reach 5,000 males, 5,000 males, in order to begin electing a territorial legislature. Thirdly, the entire territory's population had to reach 60,000, 60,000 free inhabitants. So this does not include slaves or Native Americans in order to draft a state constitution. And then once they drafted a state constitution, they could appeal to the one house legislature and appeal for statehood. And lastly, the United States one house legislature was also able to pass something called the Southwest Ordinance. The Southwest Ordinance of 1790 basically does the same thing as the Northwest Ordinance, but with this major difference. The Southwest Ordinance of 1790 did not ban slavery south of the Ohio River. It established territories that were south of the Ohio River and eventually become the states of Tennessee. Now, the state of Tennessee was born out of the Southwest Ordinance of 1790, so that's a key distinction that you'll need to know. So the Northwest Ordinance of 1787, it bans slavery north of the Ohio River. The Southwest Ordinance of 1790 does not ban slavery south of the Ohio River. Well, class, that does wrap up lecture number 3 of exam number 2. Remember, you'll need to watch this you'll need to watch this lecture before you take exam 2. And as always, if you have any questions, feel free to email me. But hopefully I will see you guys next time in class, and hopefully we'll all be feeling a little bit better by then. But I'll see you then.